38 countries had done it before us or during the same time. Pottinger had also said that it was really important to shut down flights to and from Europe. But as Jonathan Swan said, but as Jonathan Lemire said, he didn't want to do that. And Mnuchin vetoed that idea because he said it would roil the markets and would be bad for the economy. Now, of course, we have found out that most of the outbreaks in New York City are due to people coming from Europe to the United States. So again, a decision where people coming from Europe to the United States. So again, a decision where you're making that balance to the United States. So again, are due to people coming from Europe to the United States. So again, a decision where you're making that balance, but early on especially, all of the president's decisions, all of Steve Mnuchin's decisions were being made, ignoring the warnings from inside the administration that this was coming and it was bad.
Let's get into the details of the sweeping new reporting from the New York Times, from intelligence agencies to cabinet department experts to top White House advisors. The paper's examination found, quote, the president was warned about the potential for a pandemic, but that internal divisions, lack of planning, and his faith in his own instincts led to a halting response. In short, Trump was warned by, quote, the very people in his government whose expertise and long experience might have guided him more quickly towards steps that would slow the virus and likely save lives. The paper begins in early January. Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger was rattled by a call with a Hong Kong epidemiologist who bluntly warned him a ferocious new outbreak had emerged in China. It had spread far more quickly than the government was admitting to, and it wouldn't be long before it reached other parts of the world. It was one of the earliest warnings to the White House, and it echoed the intelligence reports making their way to the National Security Council. The more specialized corners of the intelligence world were producing sophisticated and chilling warnings. At the same time, the paper reports, in a report to the Director of National Intelligence, the State Department's epidemiologist wrote in early January that the virus was likely to spread across the globe and warned that the coronavirus could develop into a pandemic. Working independently, a small outpost of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Center for Medical Intelligence, came to the same conclusion. Within weeks after getting initial information about the virus early in the year, biodefense experts inside the National Security Council, looking at what was happening in Wuhan, started urging officials to think about what would be needed to quarantine a city the size of Chicago. But even as HHS Secretary Alex Azar first briefed the president on the potential seriousness of the virus during a January 18th phone call, Trump projected confidence.
Are there words about a pandemic at this point?
No, not at all, and we have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
January 27th, a National Security Council meeting in the Situation Room was jolted when Stephen E. Biegun, the newly installed Deputy Secretary of State, announced plans to issue a level 4 travel warning, strongly discouraging Americans from traveling to China. The room erupted into bickering. In late January, the president was told at the time about a January 29th memo produced by his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, laying out in striking detail the potential risks of a coronavirus pandemic, as many as 500,000 deaths and trillions of dollars in economic losses. Trump denied ever seeing it.
Did you see these memos that reportedly Peter Navarro wrote back in January? When did you see them, and how does these memos sort of square with what you've often said that nobody could have predicted this? It sounds like he was predicting.
I didn't see him, but I heard he wrote some memos talking about pandemic.
Yeah, he said I never read them. January 30th, then acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and Secretary Azar called Trump aboard Air Force One as the president was making the final decision to go ahead with the restrictions on China travel. Azar was blunt. warning that a virus could develop into a pandemic and arguing that China should be criticized for failing to be transparent. Stop panicking, Mr. Trump told him. January 31st, the limits on travel from China were publicly announced. But the Times found that nearly 40,000 Americans and authorized travelers have come into the U.S. from China since Trump imposed those restrictions. February 13th, Secretary Azar announced a plan to repurpose a flu surveillance system in 5 major cities to help track the virus among the general population. The effort all but collapsed even before it got started as Mr. Azar struggled to win approval for $100 million in funding, and the CDC failed to make reliable tests available. February 21st, the White House Coronavirus Task Force gathered. Among the questions on the agenda, when should it be recommended that Trump take textbook mitigation measures, such as school closings and cancellations of mass gatherings? The group concluded they would soon need to move forward with aggressive social distancing, even at the risk of severe disruption to the nation's economy and the daily lives of millions of Americans. February 23rd, Dr. Robert Kadlec, the top disaster response official at the HHS, came across an email from a researcher at Georgia Tech regarding a Chinese woman who infected 5 relatives with the virus, even though she never displayed any symptoms herself. Is this true? Kadlec wrote back. If so, we have a huge hole on our screening and quarantine effort. The blunt reply: people are carrying the virus everywhere. The very next day, Dr. Kadlec, the top disaster response official at HHS, along with the rest of the task force, decided to present Mr. Trump with a plan titled 4 Steps to Mitigation, telling the president that they needed to begin preparing Americans for a step rarely taken in United States history. But the next several days, a presidential blow-up and internal turf fights would sidetrack such a move. By the 3rd week in February, the administration's top public health experts concluded they should recommend to Mr. Trump a new approach that would include warning the American people of the risks and urging steps like social distancing and staying home from work. But the White House focused instead on messaging, and crucial additional weeks went by before their views were reluctantly accepted by the president, the time the virus spread largely unimpeded. March 16th, even as Trump announced 2 weeks of new social distancing guidelines, the subsequent economic disruptions were so severe that the president repeatedly suggested that he wanted to lift even those temporary restrictions. He frequently asked aides why his administration was still being blamed in news coverage for the widespread failures involving testing, insisting the responsibility had shifted to the states. Wow. Let's bring in investigative reporter with the New York Times, who is one of the few reporters on this expansive piece. A lot of different sources and a lot of different folks working on this. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really appreciating this reporting. It is so step by step by step by step. It lays out the many different warnings.
So, Eric, thank you. Eric Lipton, thank you for being with us in the New York Times. I guess the takeaway is you look and you see that the National Security Council, especially Matthew Pottinger, very concerned, the State Department, the Pentagon, the National Security Council, as I said before, of course, the CDC, the HHS, all of these agencies and the Trump administration knew about what was going on in China and were fearful that a full-blown pandemic could explode. And that was in early January. What did your reporting find the biggest obstacle was from them being able to turn those fears and concerns of the coming pandemic in early January into policy that could have saved so many Americans' lives?
I think that there's a lot that happened here that sort of tells us about the Trump administration, things that we've known for several years now, but we haven't had a crisis that was going to test this administration in the way that this has. And the inability to make a decision, the the disagreements among key members of the White House staff, the fact that you had a chief of staff who was on the way out and was unable to, have the respect of his colleagues and make it decisive choices to advise the president, and a Secretary of Health and Human Services who also did not have full respect of the president, and disagreements among the economic team and the health team that really almost, that left a lack of a clear consensus as to what choice the president should make. But really, all this goes back to 2006 and the Bush administration, when leaders in the Bush administration realized that it was just a matter of time before there was going to be a pandemic that was going to threaten the United States. And they prepared this plan, which laid out in a very prescriptive way the steps that would need to be taken. And there's really two stages. And the stages it's very simple. I mean, it's simple, on its face: containment and mitigation. And containment is when you can actually limit the threat from coming into the United States. And if it does come, you do these contact tracing in which you identify people who are infected by the individuals who have the virus, and you isolate them. But there's a certain point when you lose the ability to contain it, and you go to what's then called mitigation. And mitigation is when you do social distancing, you close businesses, you close schools, and you do it only in targeted parts of the United States where it occurs. You don't do it across the United States at once. The biggest thing that happened here was that the president of the United States was convinced. This is a guy who feels that he can control borders, that he's got the powers, extraordinary powers around the borders, that he thought that he could contain this virus, and they waited weeks too long to move to mitigation. And that's what Fauci was talking about. When do you go from containment to mitigation? The scientists know that you have basically 2 weeks from the point of your first death or a certain number of cases of the virus confirmed in a community to switch to mitigation. And if you don't do it, you will have many, many deaths in that community. It's a prescription. And they sat and waited. And now, of course, it's the governor's choices as to when to shut down schools and businesses. But the doctors who work in these federal agencies told me that they need a leader in the federal government to take the flack and to say it's time to close the schools and businesses in this location. Again, it didn't need to be a national call. It needed to be in hot spots. And they needed the cover from a federal official, from a surgeon general, from a president, from someone at NIH or the CDC, because the governors are in a difficult place.
Right. Well, so help me out as far as the communication inside the White House goes. So in early January, looking at your article, the National Security Council, the State Department, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, the CDC, Department of Health and Human Services, the intel community, everybody knew about this. The president was getting it in his daily briefings. Starting most likely, I guess, around January 6th or so. And yet the first we hear of anybody communicating with the president verbally by phone was Alex Azar on the 18th of January. Was that the first time the president would take anybody's call on the coronavirus, or had he spoken with anybody before that?
I mean, that's hard to know for sure. That's the first time that we're aware of. But there's no question that the people in the national security staff were discussing this from early January and probably in late December. And as to when the first explicit conversation is, that's the date that we have. And I mean, in January, it was a matter of this is a pandemic. It was spreading at an incredibly rapid rate. It was essentially all but certain it was going to come to the United States, and there was going to be spread in the United States. The real question, in my mind, for January is at that point they knew that they were going to have shortages of PPE, mask, and they knew that there was going to be hospital bed shortages that were likely going to occur. They knew that that ventilators, they could have been thinking about ventilators. They could have started the acquisition process in January for personal protective equipment. That was a critical thing they could have done. What's the status of our supply chain? How sufficient is the stockpile? Those are things that they waited until March to really get started on. They didn't make any significant orders until March. That's a long time to have not. Now, at that point in January, they did not know how wide the spread would be in the United States, but it was essentially a foregone conclusion that there was this was coming to the United States and people were going to be sick and some people were going to die.
All right, Eric Lipton, thank you very, very much for your extensive reporting.
What
It's
an important article.
when
Thank
you read
so
about
much.
the bickering, Joe, on January 27th, you just wonder when it's so clear, when the choices are so few.
Well,
I mean, a virus is you have to separate people. You have very few choices, if any. You have one choice. What are they fighting about in there?
And you look at these dates that are laid out,
Incredible.
and I know of close friends of mine who were calling the president and repeatedly saying, and the White House repeatedly saying, the window is closing. The window is closing. You have to do this in the next week. The window, and it kept being this rolling thing, and that was happening inside the White House. And again, no real
It just kept being delayed.
moves were made. The president didn't even seem to take this seriously until March, 2 months after.
Just like he hasn't never taken the global atmosphere crisis pertaining to global warming serious.
Let me say that again. 2 months after he started getting warned in his presidential daily briefings. 2 months after the State Department, the Pentagon, the Department of HHS, the CDC, you can go down the list, the intel community, they all knew, Mika, and the president is trying to point fingers.
We have more reporting ahead.
And Bill Kristol said as evidence, he wasn't behind the curve on the coronavirus. Trump likes to cite the end of the January China ban, but this is damning, not exculpatory. For if Trump realized there was a real problem at the end of January, why did he do almost nothing for the whole month of February? That's a good question. But Ed Luce, I have another question. If you're going to do a China ban, then for God's sake, do a China ban. 430,000 people came to the United States from China from the outbreak of the coronavirus, and 40,000 came from China to the United States after Donald Trump put in this halfway ban.
Yeah, it was very incomplete. I think that the way that Trump talks about the timeline here, both through his flurry of tweets in response to that impressive New York Times piece yesterday, and also more generally at his daily press conferences, it's as though he were inaugurated on January the 20th, 2020. Not January the 20th, 2017. So he inherited faulty tests, whatever that means, because you can only have bespoke tests for particular viruses. And of course, the Obama administration didn't have the coronavirus, COVID-19. He inherited a stockpile that was depleted. Again, he'd been in office 3 years. He'd had plenty of time to build up a stockpile. And he inherited all kinds of things, apparently, that would make sense if he'd been inaugurated a few weeks ago in January 2020 and had just started this job and was a rookie. But he's been in office for more than 3 years. The other sort of point here is we're talking as though, well, he was really late, but he did get up to speed. He hasn't got up to speed. That's the thing. We're not doing anything like the tests, the scale of testing that's required. It's still very incomplete, very partial. There is no national plan. The White House is talking again. The economists in the White House, like Larry Kudlow, who, as you recall, said this thing was almost airtight, are talking about reopening the economy at the beginning of May, just 2 weeks from now, as they were 10 days ago about opening it over the Easter weekend. So again, we've got this pressure to reopen the economy. And if we reopen prematurely, then it's going to be just as damaging in terms of lives lost and in terms of risking the general health of the population as those 6 wasted weeks were that have been so well chronicled by the New York Times. We need to get testing up. It's nowhere near the level that it should be at.
It's almost as if we're under the guidance of a madman. An absolute lunatic. You know, you delay putting out various orders And then whenever you do finally, whenever reality does finally hit you to the point that this is real, then rather than shutting down certain hotspots, you want to shut down the whole government. And now, since the government has been shut down, now you want to go back and open up the government again. And the coronavirus here in the United States isn't but maybe a third done. Talk about adding insult to misery. As I said before, this is jaw-dropping. This is heart-wrenching. To the point that it makes you wonder if we're under the guidance of a madman, a lunatic, that should have given out proper warnings at proper times so that the people could have promptly gotten ready for this. And we're talking about the professionals. We're just not talking about the average Joe out here wandering around in the streets. We're talking about people that has dedicated their lives to the healthcare industry. They have dedicated their lives to wanting to save lives. And to have something like this done is just absolutely asinizing. It's appalling. It don't even fit under the category of a travesty, because even a travesty eventually can be looked over. That's what they're saying here. Where are we in America whenever it comes to good, sound, dedicated leadership? The leadership of various agencies and various people that is supposed to be in control of the betterment of people's lives.
And of course, Larry Kudlow in that bizarre clip suggesting that some people just wanted to stay home because they were lazy. And when in fact, I'm sure members of the administration are not going out in crowds. I'm sure these talk show hosts that are talking about ending social distancing aren't pushing their families into large crowds or into workspaces. The hypocrisy was extraordinary at the beginning of this crisis for those that were mocking it. It remains extraordinary. And Caddy, Ed brings up a great point. Yes, we're looking back at all the agencies that knew in early January: the National Security Council, the State Department, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, the CDC, the HHS, the president himself with his presidential daily briefings. We see all the steps on how they botched the testing, how the FDA, one of the leaders of the FDA said to the CDC in late February, if you were a private industry, we would shut you down. You've botched this so badly, and then open it up to the general public. But here we are in April, and on April the 13th,
April the 13th, a day after a massive outbreak of tornadoes once more ravaging various areas of this country because of the unstableness in the environment pertaining to the global warming that once more a president has been in denial about. Pertaining to the global warming, the environmental crisis. We've just recently been bombarded. I haven't even seen the latest on the death toll. I know the death toll was on up there about 6 or 8 last night that they figured out that people that they couldn't find. But it's just unbelievable the position where we are right now as Americans. It's unbelievable.
We're talking about missteps from what they knew in early January, and Donald Trump still has no plan for testing, no clue for testing. You could look back. He's lied time and time again. He lied at the CDC on March the 6th, saying any American who wants a test can have a test. Here we are, April 13th. People still can't get the test. And every day it seems they come up and they lie about a new testing plan, when in fact, Donald Trump has still done nothing to make testing a national effort in an expansive way. Even his biggest supporters are quietly concerned in the Senate and the House about the lack of testing that America still has.
The lack of leadership.
You know, this reminds me a little bit of every time there is a mass shooting in the United States, we're told by the gun lobby that this is not the time to talk about gun legislation.
Right.
And this is what the White House is telling us at the moment. This is not the time to look backwards. We should just be looking forwards. There will be time later on to go over what happened in January and February. Actually, this is exactly the time to do what the New York Times is doing, because what happened in the past on this, January and February, informs our knowledge about what is happening right now and how the administration is handling it. And you said, Joe, you're right, that actually the key issue now still is testing, tracing, and quarantine. And we've been promised, every time the president stands up there, he talks about how America is doing more testing than any other country in the world. That is patently not true. When you take it on a per capita basis, America is still way down there when it comes to testing. And without that testing, yeah, we may have got through the peak. We may not be at the peak, but it's sort of irrelevant because we can't open up the country until we have testing, tracing, and quarantine. He was getting advice from people in his own administration, but he could also have looked around the world. It was on February the 3rd. Hong Kong shut its borders with China. Now, for Hong Kong to shut its border with China and risk the ire of Beijing, that was a huge deal. And I remember speaking to people at the time saying to me, watch what Hong Kong is doing, and that will show you how serious this is going to get around the world, because they wouldn't have done it unless they thought it was serious. So there were plenty of examples from other countries where the president could have said, okay, this is what I need to do, but we keep coming back to his obsession with the markets. The reason there was those lost opportunities in January and February time and again was because his administration was more concerned about the state of the markets, because he sees that as his election bellwether, than he was about the health and the security of the country. He felt somehow that America might be invulnerable, or else he was just not listening to those people properly. But yeah, we have to look at what happened in January and February because it informs our knowledge about what's happening now, and we've got to get the tests up. You look at countries that are coming out of the shutdown now, they are countries that test it. It's very simple.
Yeah, and you know, I said weeks ago, let's worry about what happened in the past after this is all over. As long as the White House is moving forward, let's worry about what's going on right now. Unfortunately, Jonathan Lemire, the president still has not moved forward, especially on testing. And we have 2 months of failures. We have 2 months of promises. And again, you look at one of the largest counties in Florida, Palm Beach County, it is still hard to get testing. Not only here, it's hard to get testing in Texas, it's hard to get testing in California, it's hard to get testing in New York, it's hard to get testing anywhere because there's not been a national effort. And so what I don't understand, and maybe in all of your reporting, maybe you've gotten some hint of this, why is it that the president has stubbornly refused to take a national, an aggressive, strong national push towards developing testing when, you know, I heard Scott Gottlieb and Rich Lowry's National Review podcast a couple of nights ago saying the only way we reopen this economy is with expansive testing. And that's what everybody said. Rich is like, what about we send a swab around to every American? I know that sounds crazy, and Gottlieb said, that doesn't sound crazy. I mean, but we've got to do something. We've got to be aggressive. And yet this president, again, like I said, I mean, it's like opening kickoff of this pandemic crisis. He takes off his helmet and uniform and runs to the sideline and sits on the bench. He is not engaged in the most important issues of this so-called war, as he described it.
testing is the key. In New York City, testing is still so scarce. You can only get one if you're going to the hospital and you're sick enough that you may be admitted. So there's simply no way for the large amount of the populace to be tested. And I think there's a few things at play here. First of all, the president is loath to admit any sort of error or mistake, so he doesn't want to talk about testing failures that have happened before. As Caddy correctly points out, he's trotting out misleading statistics day after day from the White House briefing room podium, suggesting that the U.S.'s testing efforts were far better than other nations. Yeah, he's absolutely lying about the testing ability of the United States compared to other nations like, say, South Korea. He's been reluctant to mobilize the federal government to take the lead on a number of production issues, medical supplies like masks and ventilators, but also testing, putting it again in the hands of the states to say that they should be responsible for their own testing efforts, that they need to be ready to reopen, that they're in charge of that. And some of that is to, again, have some sort of White House deniability if things don't go well, if it's in the hands of the state houses rather than in the Oval Office. And this is now the fight that we're about to have inside the West Wing. It's percolating already. We're seeing it. We're seeing the economists urging the president to move forward and to reopen the economy as best he can. We're seeing the doctors to preach caution. And what they're doing is suggesting this can only be done, Mr. President, if we have widespread testing to know who is infected, who's not, who's asymptomatic, and so on. So therefore, otherwise, the economy may reopen and then have to be shut down again. And that would be far more devastating, not just to the president's markets, which he cares so much about, but the nation as a whole.
Such amateurs. Amateur behavior. Very, very amateur behavior. This is not what the people hired people to do. Americans deserve better than this.
Well, and Mika, it's very interesting while we're talking about Donald Trump and Dr. Fauci this weekend, the news came out that Donald Trump just said, hey, why don't we just let it wash over the American people, and basically said, let people that die, die. This is what Boris Johnson in the UK had talked about, this herd immunity, and then they were told, well, if you do that, you can do that, but 500,000 Brits will die and 2.2 million Americans will die. And so then the president backed off of that, but that actually was a position that he was considering taking, just letting a ton of senior citizens die. As I said before, the greatest generation, and Dr. Fauci had to walk him off of that ledge.
And this is really incredible. And if you look at this presidency as it's gone, he's been able to try and have it.
Is that not madness or what? Is that not the grounds of a lunatic or a madman?
Both ways, with whether it's redacting parts of the Mueller report or getting the public completely kind of worn down over the Ukraine story. But you can't have it both ways with this virus. You just can't. You can't redact this. You can't sort of rebrand it. You can't find a way out with 22,000 dead and counting.
And counting. And counting. We are still in the storm. We are still in the coronavirus COVID-19 storm. The pandemic is still happening.
We have a look now at some key countries around the world, and we start in Italy, where world-renowned opera star Andrea Bocelli sang Amazing Grace in front of the empty Cathedral of Milan on Easter Sunday.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now
beautiful.
Gorgeous.
We have NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley standing by for us in Rome. Also in London, NBC News correspondent Cal Perry. And in Beijing, NBC News foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Frayer. We thank you all for being with us. I think we'll start with our Matt in. I was trying to get our location straight. That was so incredible what we just saw, but the numbers now where America does surpass Italy. This is not a race we want to win. The president's always talking about being number one in the world. He says we're the best in the world with testing. We're not. And it appears that the only number where we are surpassing is in deaths.
The deceased.
That's right. Here in Italy, we're actually seeing a decrease. There was about a little over 400 deaths just yesterday, and these statistics, they come out daily. Those numbers have a habit of shooting right back up again, right when there's a hint of optimism. But, officials here believe that the curve has finally flattened here in Italy, and that's why they're still not taking any chances. This discussion in America about when to lift the lockdown. Here in Italy, there's a lot of pressure on the government. Businesses, especially some of the top big brands, major industries, are pressuring the government to try to lift this lockdown. But the Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, he's not taking any chances. He's just extended it further, another 3 weeks. Now, some of the best indicators show that the Italian economy will likely shrink by as much as 6%. And that's if this whole crisis is over by May. So, this is going to be a major blow, especially to small businesses. 95% of businesses here in Italy employ fewer than 10 people. This is a country of small shops and stores and restaurants. Those restaurants and bars, especially around here in Rome, they can't really expect to be open probably within the next several weeks. So we are starting to see a little bit of an easing of the lockdown as the curve has flattened. Tomorrow, we're seeing some categories of businesses opening. We're going to be seeing stationery shops, children's clothing stores, and bookstores all opening for a limited amount of time. But, we've spoken to some of them. A lot of these business owners, they don't even want to open because they can't necessarily survive with so few customers while, the lockdown continues.
Exactly.
Guys?
Matt Bradley,
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so much. So much sad news coming out of Italy, but certainly great news finally that the curve is flattening. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Let's go next to Beijing and Janice Mackey-Frayer. Janice, so obviously China, this hit China first. They're a little further along than Italy is with the curve, but talk about the return to normalcy and how slow and halting it is, still is in China. What can you tell us about this weekend?
Well, every move here is cautious because the numbers haven't gone away. China is still posting new cases every day. In the past day, it's up to 108, and nearly half of them are linked to one small city on the northern border with Russia, where Chinese citizens have been returning from Russia and testing positive for the virus. There was one flight that landed in Shanghai. 60 people on board tested positive for COVID-19. So these are the hotspots that China is still concerned with, and why they are taking such slow and cautious steps. And all of these steps are linked very closely to aggressive testing. In Beijing alone, they're averaging about 8,000 tests per day. They've done 40,000 tests on people since the 1st of April. Even to book a train ticket to come out of Wuhan, you need to test positive. Before you get on the train, you have to test again. You go into quarantine. You come out only when you test negative. So what China has been trying to do is push this aggressive approach to testing so that they know where they stand, especially with asymptomatic cases. They've been tracking those only since the 1st of April, but this is another category that they seem very intent on watching as they're trying to take these moves to get the economy back on track. There are more businesses that are reopening here, more factories are coming online, but it's not to say that things are back to normal across the board. Kids still aren't in school. There are a lot of businesses that are still closed. Some people are still working from home, but they are so fearful of having this second wave of infections. And if we take a look at Japan, let's say, now reporting over 500 cases a day. The northern island of Hokkaido has had to declare a state of emergency for a second time. They let the kids go back to school. They let a lot of businesses reopen, but they're seeing the case numbers edging higher again, and they're alarmed at how quickly those cases are multiplying. So they've got a second state of emergency. The borders in Japan are all but closed, and we're seeing this trend in countries across Asia as they're trying to prevent this second wave of infections.
Janice Mackey-Freyer, thank you so much, and please stay safe in Beijing. We greatly appreciate it. Let's go now to London and Cal Perry. And Cal, it seems good news out of Italy, some good news in the past out of China, but obviously some worries. But it's still the United States and the United Kingdom that continues to see their death rate skyrocket. What's happening in the UK, other than obviously the great news that Boris Johnson returned home?
Yeah, that's the good news in the last 24 hours. After a week in the hospital and more than 3 days in intensive care, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, was released from hospital yesterday. He stopped by 10 Downing Street, where he taped a 5-minute message posted on social media to the nation. He thanked the National Health Service, the NHS here, for saving his life. He individually thanked nurses by name and doctors as well, singling out 2 nurses that were by his bedside, as he said, during the worst 48 hours. He said it could have gone either way. That's quite literally the case. When you look at the statistics here in the UK amongst coronavirus patients who go to the ICU, there's about a 50% survival rate. So touch and go, to say the least, for the Prime Minister, but symbolically a huge moment for the country. He's now headed out to Chequers. That is the Prime Minister's residence. It is also the country home. He'll be there with his fiancée, who is pregnant herself. She thinks she's recovering from the coronavirus. She hasn't been able to get a test, but she said she's had the symptoms. She is recovered. Doctors have said the Prime Minister needs to spend more downtime. He will not be taking back over that role of Prime Minister. We'll continue to see Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, in that role. That is the good news. The bad news is that the United Kingdom is now the 5th country around the world to pass that 10,000 death mark, joining France, Italy, Spain, and the United States. 737 dead in the last 24 hours. I do want to stress, though, and this is going to be a coming story here, those are deaths in hospitals. We don't know about people who are dying at home or who are dying in rest homes, so it's quite possible that we are seeing the low end of the death toll so far here, guys.
All right, NBC's Cal Perry, thank you so much. Caddy K, it is remarkable to hear what's going on across the world and see that the 2 countries that really took the lead among the free countries in World War II are the 2 countries who've responded the most poorly to this global threat, are the 2 countries that kept their head in the sand for the longest. Thank God Boris Johnson is doing well now, but of course he was going around shaking hands almost in a mocking tone early on, and now he understands. He literally, you could call it a near deathbed conversion for Boris Johnson, and great news that he's doing better. But why is it taking the governments of the United States and the governments of the United Kingdom so long to get the message that this pandemic is a deadly threat?
You know, when you go back to early March and the end of February and you hear what Donald Trump was saying about this epidemic and what Boris Johnson was saying on March the 3rd, kind of almost bragging about the fact that, well, I'm glad to say that I'm still shaking hands with people. It's almost like there's a sense of invulnerability, that they didn't believe that their countries, these great nations, were going to be hit in this way. And there had been, you know, some sense of kind of this was a Chinese problem. This was something that happened far away and to other people. And even when it reared its head in Italy, amongst other Northern European countries, many of them felt, well, this was an Italian problem. It was always somebody else's problem, first China and then Italy. And they didn't really believe, I think, that it was going to come to their borders in the same way. They didn't believe here in the United States that if it did come, it couldn't be contained, because America has famously the greatest healthcare system in the world. That's now going to have to be revisited, I think, in the light of this, that belief. But there's something about having some humility and realizing that your system and your country is as vulnerable as other countries, and therefore you have to set about this in a very scientific, very methodical way. You look at countries that are coming out of this, it is the countries that shut down early and that tested comprehensively. And I think that is maybe out of this, there will be a realization that yes, things that happen in other places can happen in the UK, can happen in the United States, and perhaps more importantly, what can we learn from those other countries? Have a little humility about this. What is it that those other countries did well in their healthcare systems that we can learn for? Maybe we don't have the best. Maybe there are areas we can learn in order to try and improve ourselves, to try and make ourselves the best. But at the moment, the US and the UK have quite a lot of learning to do.
Well,
Yes.
Ed Luce, there probably is no other country that had the resources, that had the expertise, that had the ability to face this coronavirus in the United States of America. And yet we failed time and time again to understand the warnings that were coming from China to the Trump administration in early January. I listened to Janice's report out of Beijing, and I wonder if we're going to repeat that mistake again a few months later, where we miss the second wave of warning. So what's happening in China, that the infections are starting back up because they may be opening up too quickly. In Japan, they're having to shut things down because they're getting another wave. It seems, again, right now, if you listen to the president, he may not be learning from his past mistakes, and he may not be learning from what is unfolding right now in front of us, from Beijing to Rome.
I think that's absolutely right. You know, the history of epidemics, of any kind of epidemic throughout history, is that they don't tend to stop after one wave. They come back, second wave, third wave. There tends to be relaxation and then a return of the pathogen and then a tightening up again. And so what we need to be seeing is a lot more preparation of the public than the Trump administration is giving. This could come back again in the fall. It could come back again next year. And that until we have a vaccine, until we're inoculating at least 3/4 of the population, and not just our own population, but populations in other countries, a massive logistical challenge, then we're not going to return to normality. And I'm concerned that people aren't being prepped for that. They're not aware of the fact that this probably is a 12 to 18, possibly even 24-month long cycle of troughs and peaks, rather than one long, as Ron Klain, Obama's Ebola czar, put it, rather than one long parabola. This is a bumpy chart. This is a bumpy curve on the chart, and we've got to get used to thinking of it like that. I see almost no preparation of the public mind for this. Again, we're stuck on this May 1st, that we can just all go back to normal. And I don't think, even if the White House persuaded governors to agree with it on the May 1st return to normality date, I don't think a lot of consumers, I don't think a lot of ordinary Americans would actually trust that. I don't think they would be rushing out to shopping malls and movie theaters. So they're ahead of the White House in terms of messaging.
Yeah, they are, and we've said this before. And Mr. President, you can lie to your supporters about Bob Mueller, and they'll believe you because they don't really know who Bob Mueller is. You can lie about Ukraine because they're not going. You know what? They're trying to take care of their families.
It was perfect.
Okay. They're fighting in Washington. This Republican. You know what? They'll believe you on that, but they're not going to believe you on this when they see people that they know dying in nursing homes. They see people that they know dying in their community. They see nurses and doctors pushed to the wall here. This is not something. Again, there is no art of the deal when it comes to a pandemic. It's just not. It is black and white. It is life and death. And yes. Every doctor, I go back to Scott Gottlieb talking National Review's Rich Lowry said this is going to come back in the fall in some form. Dr. Fauci has said that. In fact, I haven't talked to a doctor or a medical expert that hasn't said this is coming back in the fall. We have to prepare for it, and we have to work hard all summer to be ready when it comes back in the fall, because if you're not ready in the fall during the flu season, it's going to be worse. Mr. President, did you hear that? If you don't work constantly to get national testing between now and the fall, Mr. President, it's April 13th right now. I'm warning you. Your doctors are warning you. Your medical experts are warning you. The whole world is warning you. It could be worse in the fall. So you have to work every day to move towards national testing. That is our way out of this. This is how small business owners can get back to work. This is how we stop losing trillions of dollars. It seems week after week after week. I mean, Mr. President, please, you're several months into this. Get serious about testing. Enact the Defense Production Act. And do it now for national testing. It's your only way out of this crisis.
Let's focus on really ground zero here in the United States. The staggering death toll in New York continues to inch closer to 10,000. Over the holiday weekend, more than 1,500 people died in the Empire State, but the number of new coronavirus cases did show signs of stabilizing. Mayor Bill de Blasio will join us in just a moment. But first, let's bring in Chair of Emergency Medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and the Mount Sinai Health System, Dr. Brendan Carr. Dr. Carr, give us a sense of what the ERs are enduring right now. Are there any changes, any upticks or downticks?
Thanks. Good morning. There are. The good news is that, as you said, the numbers are stabilizing. The bad news is that we're still dependent upon the surge hospitals that have been built, both in Central Park and in the Javits Center. The illness has a long duration, as you know. So, 10 days, 14 days, even though we're seeing some decrease in the number of people coming in, we still have very, very full hospitals. We still have very, very overstretched healthcare system.
Let me ask you about that. We've obviously been worried from the very beginning about the number of beds, about ventilators, about masks, about protective gear. How are New York City hospitals holding up right now? Do we have enough in New York?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The governor said this weekend that the peak is really a plateau, which is an interesting thing to think about and exactly what we're seeing. Some of the private healthcare systems have always had enough, not a great margin, but enough of a margin to stay ahead. Some of the public systems struggled a little bit more, as everybody knows, over the last couple of weeks. It's compelling to me to think about how the private sector has responded to this. There has been a lot of effort to make sure that production is ramped up, to make sure that distribution and supply chains are sort of changed in a way that we hadn't previously expected or required them to be. So I would say yes. Our ventilator use rate within my health system, which is a large health system, big integrated health system in New York City, is down below 80% now. A lot of that is because of ventilators that have been brought in and because of the way that we have really aggressively scienced our way out of some of this trouble by talking with our engineering folks, by using devices that weren't previously meant to be ventilators and turning them into ventilators. Jeez. There's a lot of hope on the private sector side of responding to this.
And I'm wondering how your doctors and nurses and health professionals are faring through this. We're reading so many stories of them getting sick themselves. How are you managing keeping the staffing up, the morale up? And do you have any sense of how many health professionals have fallen ill, even in your system alone?
Yeah, this is hard. It's nice of you to ask about the healthcare providers. Thanks very much. This is hard because there's community transmission of the disease, as you know. Right. So, of course, they're getting sick in the same way that everyone else is getting sick. And beyond that, I would even say their family members, their loved ones are getting sick. Early on, the first couple of weeks, the first month, this was about muscle memory and adrenaline. And the healthcare system really has extraordinarily sort of been tested. and has really stood up to that test. What we're seeing now, I would even say after what many people tried to make into a couple days of reflective time with their families over the holiday, is we're seeing some time to reflect, some time to feel the loneliness and to feel the effects of the trauma starting to rear their heads. And this will be a long tail on this. We talked about the long tail of and maybe even sort of second waves of COVID. I would argue that that is true for sure. The 1918 flu didn't stop till 1920, but the long tail and the multiple waves of experiencing and re-experiencing what has happened to our healthcare workers is something that we need to expect to sort of be managing for the long term.
You know, Mika,
Absolutely.
that's something that we talked about last week, that this is such a traumatic experience for so many healthcare workers.
And they're still in it.
And they're still in it. And people dying alone without their families, the way they die is so horrific that this is going to impact our healthcare workers for some time.
Dr. Brendan Carr, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It is 3 minutes past the top of the hour. Joining us now, the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio. Mayor de Blasio, give us a sense of how the city is faring this morning. Any new information, new numbers, new details moving forward as would it be safe to say, at a plateau in deaths and numbers?
Mika, first of all, we have lost so many people, and there's real pain in the city right now. And I think we should be very careful to not declare a new reality until we're sure. I'm not sure we have a plateau yet. I'm not sure there couldn't be a resurgence. I think our job is to stay tough and stay focused on the approach that's working. The social distancing, the shelter in place has clearly helped improve the situation. And the heroes are everyday New Yorkers who, you know, Mika, you know this city, you love this city. What would you have said the chances would be that people in the most densely packed city in America, who are used to being, you know, really close together all the time, would actually figure out quickly how to practice social distancing and shelter in place? Well, New Yorkers have done that to a remarkable degree. They're heroes. And then, as you were just talking about with our healthcare workers, I mean, it's unbelievable how they've held the line. Now, for a few weeks, it looked like our hospital system literally could be overwhelmed. And our doctors, nurses, healthcare workers held the line. It was, if this had been a military battle, it was as if, a huge enemy force was thrown at them. But they held, and they kept holding, and they're still holding. So the good story is about what New Yorkers have done. The tough part of this is we don't know exactly what this next phase looks like. We do know if you take your foot off the gas, if you for a moment let your guard down, we've seen it in Asia, instances where the disease reasserts. So I'm saying to all my fellow New Yorkers, hold the line now, because we've beat it back some, but we're going to have to hold for weeks and weeks before we can start to get to a place where we could possibly relax some of these restrictions and start to move to something more normal.
And that is the question as to when and how that is possible. And can New York City, which you describe as so many people in such a small amount of space, really working together, can New York City sustain this on a long level, like through November? Can the hospitals sustain this? Right now, you're still using field hospitals and extra help, and also in terms of families that are stuck in crisis, that need city services, that can't get to them. I just wonder what the months ahead look like and what your city might need.
So, Mika, you're exactly right. Look, I think the right way to think about this is months where we're still fighting this disease back. And no one has the perfect date about when we get back to normal, but months of making sure it never reasserts. Now, the challenge there is how do we get there? Well, first of all, we need to keep protecting and supporting the healthcare personnel, keep the hospitals strong. We need those PPEs, the personal protective equipment. We've got enough. Here's the reality in New York City. This week we're starting. We have enough for this week. We do not have enough for next week. We've done better on the ventilators, thank God, because we see fewer people surging into the ICUs. But for a while there, it looked like we were going to run out of ventilators, and there's nothing to say that's not going to be a challenge again. So we've got to stay focused But to get to the next phase, to get to the phase that we would call low-level transmission, when we're starting actually downhill towards normal, we need the testing. And Mika, I've got to tell you, when the history is written, this is going to be the central topic, that it was not there, and a lot of us were demanding it in January and February, never came from the federal government. We've been demanding it every day since. We can't make that transition back to normal without testing on a much wider scale, because you know what we want to do? We want to get back to a containment strategy. We want to beat this disease back, and then whenever you find a case, trace everyone connected to that case, make sure they're isolated, quarantined, get the support they need, constantly test people, constantly know who has it, who doesn't, so we can get our way back to normal. But right now, every time I ask the federal government for more testing, I hear it's not yet possible. So we've got to come to grips with the fact that this country not only was not prepared, still hasn't figured out, our national government still hasn't figured out how to provide testing on a wide scale. And that's the only way we get to normal. There's this obsession about, and I understand it for sure, reopen the country, reopen the economy. But let's not kid ourselves. If you don't have testing, if you have hospitals that are still, a week away from running out of PPEs, if you've got local governments that can barely provide critical services, basic services, because of course we're running out of money on top of everything else.
Right.
If all those things are unclear, how are we going to get back to normal? So I think the federal government, Washington, has to put the horse before the cart if they really want to see a recovery.
Well, and Mika, I want to just follow up really quickly on something that the mayor said, and that is that we've been lied to by the Trump administration repeatedly about testing. They've given us numbers about all the people that are going to be tested. They never follow through with it. I remember Dr. Birx last week very upset because 80% of the testing, the facilities weren't using 80% of their actual test kits. And when that happens, we need a follow-up. We need explanations. Mike Pence tells us great things are coming. They never come on testing. Until we can test and trace, isolate, treat, and then let people go back into the workforce, we're going to be stuck here losing trillions of dollars, Mika. The president has got to nationalize this and move on it quickly.
And while I understand that
when Pence said there'll be 1 million tests by the end of the week or whatever it was, we never saw anything like that. And remember, it's not just the test kits. You need the PPEs to protect the healthcare professionals, and you need the professionals to be available and not stuck fighting the battle in the hospital. But none of this has been coordinated from Washington as a whole to say, here's how you actually recover. You recover by stabilizing the health situation. You do that with testing and all the other pieces we need to make testing work.
Right, and that was Pence's lie. Donald Trump said on March 6th, if you want a test, you can get a test. And of course, there are millions of people who want tests that still can't get it. Jonathan O'Meara is in New York and has a question.
Mr. Mayor, good morning. I'm going to charitably describe your relationship with Governor Cuomo as up and down. You and he at times have both dismissed media coverage of the rivalry as it's just politics and shouldn't be dwelled upon. But New York is in a pandemic right now. There's a lot of really worried people looking to the government for leadership and a consistent message. Over the weekend, you announced that New York City schools would remain closed for the remainder of the school year. Within an hour or two, the governor seemed to overrule you and contradict you and say that would not be the case, that no final decision had been made on schools and that it would eventually, that final call would come with him. So can you tell us right now what is going to happen with New York City schools the rest of the year, but also how does this mixed messaging, how does this this back and forth between you and the governor, how is that helpful to New Yorkers panicked in this pandemic?
Yeah, Jonathan, the governor and I have different jobs to do, and I respect the job he's doing for sure. My job is to protect the children of New York City, the parents, the families, the educators of New York City. And what I said and our schools chancellor said was really clear. We're not reopening our schools. It won't be safe for all the people we're supposed to protect. And our job, our responsibility is to them. It's not to anyone else. It's to them. And on top of that, there's no way we can bring back schools in a productive way that would actually help our kids' education by the time you came back, it would be almost time to go again. So I made very clear, I run the schools along with the chancellor under the system we have here. And the fact is, when you really look at the big picture over these months, the governor and I actually have agreed on the vast majority of things. I know the media rightfully reports on the exceptional, but the governor and I have agreed on the vast majority of strategies and approaches. There's a lot of communication between our teams. And if you look at the crisis dynamics, New York City and New York State have been, very, very consistently on the same page, except for a few times, and we work those times out. So I think the bottom line is about what is the first principle? Safety, protecting kids and families.
Exactly.
And then what's going to help you to this next phase we were just describing? Well, if we act too soon, Jonathan, if we start to, go to normal, quote unquote, or try to restart our society the wrong way, you'll see a resurgence of this disease. So, I've said that that's where we're going. The governor said yesterday he understood my position. He's looking at the whole state. That's a different responsibility. But what I've made clear is, New York City schools have to stay closed.
All right. Mayor Bill de Blasio, come back soon. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date. Let's bring in now, thank you, MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent and host of KCDC on MSNBC on Sunday nights, Casey Hunt. And
we're going to end this right here. It's very obvious that we're only a third of the way into this war. We're by far seeing a triumphant moment towards being able to go back to normalizing our lives. The proof is in the pudding towards who was lax in these decisions towards what should and shouldn't have had done in earlier parts of this pandemic. The proof is in the pudding. Now the American people can take it for what it is, and they can either excuse this type of ignorance or come the election year that's coming up this November, make a stand in regards to the American people is not going to put up with this type of intolerable, unprofessional, unaccountability type actions coming from leadership in upper echelon positions of the people that's supposed to be hired to protect us and take care of us. And I'm sure that we'll see and hear a whole lot more about it between now and November, between the election day. But the bottom line is it has costed human fatalities. That's the bottom line, because of the unprofessionalism that was done on the upper end. It's sad. It's really, really sad. I wish I could bring great harmony, good news to the world, to my viewers, but it's not going to happen today. Not in that regard. As far as the tornadoes, let's look at that real quick, if you don't mind.
Down. The head of Arvis, Kevin Saban, told me,
inspired by the sunglasses worn by our heroes in uniform, TAC glasses can do things no ordinary sunglasses can do.
That was one powerful, quick system.
Invisible objects suddenly become visible. Look,
the bulk of it right now is up towards New York. And it was down in lower parts of Mississippi and Alabama last night. So that is one powerful, heavy, quick, moving system.
Could be deadly in a tactical situation. TAC glasses improve optical clarity.
Let's see if we can get any more comeback on it.
Officials say people who have tested positive for the virus will get first priority. Then those who are waiting for test results, were exposed, or are over the age of 65 will be next in line. It's unclear how long the housing program will.
Raining outside. Well, you can always find some fitness videos online, but there are other outlets that you can turn to relieve your stress. Try cooking or baking some healthy meals for you and your family. Staying healthy is very important during this time, and if you're feeling inspired, grab a pencil and a notebook and start drawing, or pick up that book that maybe you never finished. Let your mind go somewhere else for just a little bit and you'll start to feel better. Remember, your friends and family may be feeling this.
Got it?
Got it, Mom!
Actually got fired. Clouds around tomorrow morning to keep it from getting that cold or that frosty. Still could be a little bit. It will be a cold morning, but maybe the clouds will help us out tomorrow morning. Now, during the day tomorrow, another thing that we're talking about is we may have some light precip come through. It doesn't really show much on our future cast, but enough moisture from maybe some sprinkles, maybe even a couple of wet snowflakes tomorrow. That's how chilly it's going to be, especially during the morning hours. But really, for the next couple of days, it's about temperatures more than anything. For today, the winds are going to die down pretty quickly, but it'll still be a breezy, chilly day. And despite a little sunshine, afternoon highs about 10 to 20 degrees below average.
Can do at this point, Joe.
It's staggering. People inside the administration, people outside the administration.
Now, the cleanup efforts will begin, and many people will need to contact an insurance agent. Now, Americans are not only dealing with the aftermath of these deadly storms, but also are in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. So as we social distance ourselves, insurance agents are working to help you with your claims while maintaining a safe distance. State Farm catastrophe claims specialist Casey Jones joins us live right now to talk about helping people during a pandemic and a severe weather outbreak. Casey, thank you for being with us this morning. Let's talk about what we've seen over the last 24 hours. All the widespread damage to vehicles. The question everyone has right now is how can people submit a claim now that in-person filings have been suspended?
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, as of right now, we're, as part of the State Farm family, we're trying to be there for our customers regardless. So you can still contact your agent through the phone. You can use the State Farm Pocket app. You can go to the website, and those are all going to be easy ways for them to go ahead and file the claim as normal.
All right, so how are insurance adjusters using technology to avoid face-to-face interaction?
So yeah, as of right now, just kind of like we are today, we've got video chat platforms that we can use to contact the customer. If they've got damages to the interior of their home, we're going to have them walk us through the damages that they've noticed. They can take pictures of their car if it's damaged, take pictures of their home, submit those through the State Farm Pocket app or email, whichever they choose. So that way we can help them get their estimate set up and get them paid for the damage that they sustain.
All right, let's talk about vehicles here for a second. For vehicle claims, you're setting up a drive-through vehicle tent. How exactly does that work? And what if your vehicle isn't drivable at this point?
So as far as the tents, I'm actually sitting by one right now. If you can see it, we're setting these up so the customer will schedule that with one of our claim representatives. They're going to show up at the designated time. They're going to stay in their vehicle. One of my team members is going to guide them through the tent, inspect the vehicle, and then contact them after the inspection to tell them the result of the inspection. As far as the non-drive vehicles, we are going to utilize that technology that you mentioned to get photos. If necessary, we will contact the customer, and we may actually have some proximity inspections where the adjuster goes out there and looks at the vehicle on site, but maintaining those social distances.
Right. So if you do need to go to a customer's home, only about 30 seconds left, you are still doing that if it is a necessary, a necessary evil there. But you're keeping safety measures in place, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. So myself and the rest of my State Farm family, we are going to make sure that we're wearing masks. We've got gloves that we wear. We are maintaining that at least 6 foot distance from even from our coworkers, because we want to make sure to keep everybody safe. But yeah, we're doing our best to follow those guidelines.
All right. State Farm catastrophe claims specialist Casey Jones, thanks for speaking with us this morning. I should have said just as a necessity is what I was trying to get out, Jen. Sorry, it's been a long morning. They're also using drones to assess some of the damage as well, Jen.
Yeah, getting as creative as they can be. Now, we're going to take you into your allergy tracker for today. The pollen is still high across the south, especially the tree pollen, but it's creeping north, Oklahoma and Arkansas. Now, Tennessee really seeing a lot of those higher levels. The grass pollen really coming north, too, into northern and central parts of Alabama into Mississippi. You notice that grass pollen here as you're outside today. A lot of folks being outside to do cleanup. Now let me take you back to the radar. We do have this active tornado warning still for Berkeley and Moncks Corner. The rotation is apparent on radar, and then that's within an area of strong damaging winds too.
Service isn't just a department.
They still got tornadoes going on all night long, even this morning. Good luck to all of us. Shalom to my viewers.